for third reading next sitting day. I call on Government Order of the Day number 28.
Policing Cost Recovery Amendment Bill, Committee Stage.
I declare the House in committee for the Police Cost Recovery Bill, Committee Stage.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair.
Members, the House in committee for consideration of the Policing Cost Recovery Amendment Bill. And the question, point of order, Joe Hayes.
I seek leave that all provisions be taken as one question for the purposes of this debate with a vote on each question.
So leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? There is no objection. So the question is that Part 1, Part 2 and clauses 1 to 3 stand part. I call Puta Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to take a call on the Policing Cost Recovery Amendment Bill. And before I begin my contribution, I do want to acknowledge the Honourable Phil Goff, who worked on the Select Committee and did a huge piece of work in getting this piece of legislation to the House. And I want to acknowledge his significant contribution to this Parliament and to our country, and wish him all the best in his future governance of the City of Auckland. May you go well, Phil Goff, and we will miss your contribution to this House greatly and to our party. Mr. Chairman, this bill is of particular interest to me, having the portfolio in Labour of the community and voluntary sector, with particular regards to the demands that it now places upon that sector with regards to vetting staff and volunteers who may engage in a range of activities, particularly with regards to working with vulnerable populations such as children or the elderly. And it is a piece of legislation that I have contributed a supplementary order paper to in order to amend some of the deficiencies that I see within this piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, I guess one of the most significant areas of contention that we in Labour and other members of the opposition have around this is about the definition of what is a demand service. And when I was able to sit in on the Select Committee and hear some of the submissions, that was very much at the heart of the contention around this particular piece of legislation. What is in fact a demand service? And there was lots of discussion about the public good versus private benefit. And I can recall having conversations with members about what we might define as private benefit. And one of the things that I found interesting was, with regards to people who work in the NGO and the community and voluntary sector, generally speaking, they are in that business, whether they are being paid for doing that work or not, because of their desire to better society. And in fact, what they are doing is actually in the public good. So it struck me as very odd that people who are wanting to improve conditions for children, conditions for the elderly, for the people on the most marginalised in our society, should actually be required to pay to be vetted to work in this in these particular services. That what they were doing wasn't defined as public good, but actually is defined as private benefit, because they may actually be paid to do this work. And that is at the heart of our argument, the deliberation between private benefit and public good. Some of the examples that came to the Select Committee that I heard were around, for example, search and rescue. Search and rescue services, could they be determined as being in the public interest? Well, I guess if you were the family member of somebody who was out on a boat who hadn't returned, then you would definitely be thinking it was definitely in the public interest to ensure the safety of people out on the water. But another example that we were given is about providing security, police providing security at airports, for example. Well, we would all assume that that is most definitely in the public good. But the examples that we were given could be defined as having a private benefit because you receive a salary or a wage to do this particular piece of work. When we come to looking at that in the context of what might be required under government legislation, for example, under the Vulnerable Children's Act, there are members of particular workforces who are required under that Act to have police vetting. Now, police vetting is seen as the first screen to ensure that your workforce is fit to do that particular piece of work. So with regards to working with vulnerable populations such as the elderly or children, in particular with regards to the Vulnerable Children's Act, it would be seen as imperative that you would want to do everything you could as an employer or as a government or as a provider of services, Mr. Chairman,
Order, Williams.
Thank you, to ensure that your workforce are safe. And police vetting is seen as the first mechanism in a suite of other types of mechanisms to ensure that your workforce is safe. So in that regard, my argument and the argument that members of the opposition had is that it is actually in the public good to ensure that the workforce working with children is safe as required under the Vulnerable Children's Act, and therefore you should not be charged to vet your workforce. It should be something that is core police service. Mr. Chairman, it should be something that is core police service. So are we talking about ensuring that our workforce are safe to work in these areas, or are we talking about, and this is very much an argument that the opposition have put up, the inability to fund our police services appropriately? So we go to low-hanging fruit and say that actually the vetting of staff and volunteers who work in the sector looking after children or looking after older people is an easy opportunity for us to recover some costs with regards to the work that the police do. I know that when this particular bill first came to the attention of this House, it was discussed in regards to being able to recover the costs of police to attend to things like sports fixtures or concerts where there is actually, a promoter, for example, who is making a profit, and that the cost to police those particular events could be recovered by this particular mechanism. Well, I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that actually is an appropriate use, an appropriate idea with regards to this, that someone who's going to make a substantial amount of money and who would use the police force as a means of security at a public event like that would be an appropriate time in order to recover the costs of the police to attend that particular event. We think that that's entirely appropriate, Mr. Chairman. However, when the bill actually did make it to the House and subsequently onto the Select Committee, what do we discover? We discover that actually, no, it wasn't about that at all. It was actually about charging community organisations that are largely funded by a government contract anyway, charging them to vet their staff. And in effect, what we are doing, rather than funding the police appropriately to do the work, what we are doing is taking money from another government department to fund the police to do this work, where it's literally a transfer of government funding from one organisation, from one agency to another. And that's completely inappropriate in the context of what we are trying to achieve here, really, which is to ensure that the police have all the resources that they need to complete their work. And in that regard, Mr. Chairman, I proposed a supplementary order paper to ensure that registered charities could be exempt from any charges. Now, I know that at the time the legislation came up, the community sector was quite hot about this particular topic, and they lobbied members, support parties to the government very heavily about ensuring that they could remain exempted from this particular charge. And that's right, because in terms of the argument that I have presented with regards to public good versus private benefit, community groups and registered charities should be exempt from the police vetting. And I'm pleased to say that the public pressure, the community pressure that went on those support parties actually paid out. And we know that registered charities will, through regulation, be exempt from having to pay that. And that is as it should be, because at the end of the day, demand services, as defined as private benefit versus public good, should not impact upon those people who are trying to ensure that our organisations, our society is better.